Thank you. Namaste to all our participants. Namaste to Professor Gautam Sen ji. Just wanted to take this opportunity to introduce him. Professor Gautam Sen ji is a BSc in economics and a PhD from London. He was one of the creators of the graduate program in international political economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He taught at LSE for over 2 decades as the director and lecturer in the Masters in Politics of the World Economy. Dr. Sen was a go-to advisor to the Prime Ministers Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji of India and Shri Sher Bahadur Deuba of Nepal. He has also been a senior consultant with the UNIDO and the UNDP. Dr. Sen has lectured to NATO officers in Brussels and high-ranking officers at the Royal College of Defence Studies, London. He was appointed to the Eminent Persons Group of the Indo-UK Roundtable in 2001 by the Prime Minister, the late Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji. Dr. Sen has published extensively. He is the co-author of Analyzing the Global Political Economy, Princeton University Press in 2009. He is also currently co-authoring a book for Simon Schuster Publishers on India's economic reforms. We are indeed extremely privileged to have you, sir. And the discussion for the session is on international relations, and truly we are extremely privileged to have you. So without further ado, I really hand over the session to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Namaskar, and thank you for the warm welcome. I am, of course, speaking to you all from North London on a slightly cold day. I hope you can see and hear me.
Yes, sir, you are absolutely visible. Thank you.
And without further ado, let me begin the lecture. I will let those who wish to have a copy of the principal part of the lecture. The final part is out of a couple of articles I published in India's Sunday Guardian, and I will give you the links for that too. So you have access to both of them. Those were published a couple of months ago, but this part of the lecture is something I have organized for this session. I'm, of course, very encouraged at the entire Rashtram setup, which is a pioneering and very important venture for the future of intellectual life in India. So in a way, it's appropriate that excuse me. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, who's this?
This is Dr. Samir. Dr. Samir from Belmont Health Center.
Doctor, can I call you back? Hello? Yeah, sorry. So today's subject is the intellectual and practical conceptualization of international relations in India's knowledge systems. I have a preference for Indic knowledge systems, but I don't think that is so important. What I propose to do in this lecture is to begin with an introduction that provides an overview of the issues. That's the first part, followed by an exegesis of Kautilya's basic ideas, since he is the preeminent Indic thinker on statecraft and the appropriate political strategies of the state that he has written about. And then I will conclude in the final part with an examination of India's international relations after independence and to assess whether or not they do conform to the prescriptions of our ancient traditions and, of course, Kautilya. Now, there are 3 sources for India's knowledge systems in international relations. I will call it IR henceforward. First of all, the Bhartiya epics of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the embedded sacred texts of the Bhagavad Gita, and of course, as I have already said, the most important Indic thinker on the issue, Kautilya, on politics and strategy, Chanakya. And of course, the historical practice of international relations in pre-modern Bharat. That is, how is it that our ancestors conducted international relations, and whether those experiences have a bearing on what we are describing as India's knowledge systems. The epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, articulate the centrality of righteous and moral conduct in international relations, the pursuit of justice. But it also legitimizes a very important notion that I will come back to again and again, that is realpolitik. For example, it justifies deception to achieve goals, and the supposedly notorious example of Yudhishthira misleading on the death of Ashwatthama by using his renowned credibility for honesty. There are other issues of good governance and statecraft which do have a bearing on the state's external posture. For example, taxation levels, and it is quite remarkable that the appropriate taxation level in the Santi Parva is recommended as 15% of income, which is actually a very extraordinary modern idea, particularly suited to India. And of course, in Kautilya, to avoid setback. The 4th century, and I stress 4th century in case anybody has forgotten, Kautilya, the prime minister to the Mauryan emperor Chandragupta, provides systematic prescriptions on the conduct of what is now described as foreign policy in modern parlance, and in which there is indeed an implicit wider theoretical perspective on interstate relations. So his prescriptions, which are in the form of injunctions, are underpinned by a broader theory of interstate relations. They do not, however, articulate the specifically modern conceptualization of the inherent dynamics of interstate relations as a system. So there are prescriptions, but it does not talk about the system as a whole. That is, a system with its own power politics. The idea of the logic of power has been enumerated in modern international relations by people like Hans J. Morgenthau. And beyond that, the idea of a systemic phenomenon, and I stress the word systemic for those who might be unfamiliar, that focuses on the dynamics inherent in the international system. This is not to do with the behavior of the individual state and what is recommended, but those choices which inhere in the interaction of the system as a whole. And this is called neorealism, and especially in the pioneering work in 1979 of Kenneth Waltz. So we have Kautilya on the one hand, giving injunction, then we have modern IR theory, which talks about power politics and the logic of power politics, which is very close to the perceptions of Kautilya. And then we have the innovation, that is a truly modern innovation of the system as a whole interacting to produce outcomes. But I will enumerate Kautilya's ideas, which does indeed implicitly at least presupposes a system which of course he did not specifically address. And the third and final source beyond our epics and Kautilya is the actual behavior of the historic modern Indian states that might give an idea of the immanent ideas that inhere in our historical states. I will only deal in some detail if we have time on post-independence period to evaluate how these three categories of ideas have prevailed. So let me give you a very general enumeration of the ideas before I revert back to Kautilya, the contemporary of the Greek philosopher Socrates. In the first instance, one needs to bear in mind there was only rarely a historic Bharatiya state that encompassed the entire geographical landscape of what is Bharat. It came close during the Mauryan dynasty and Ashoka. Very briefly, under Akbar, actually, the Mughal dominance really is from a couple of decades after Akbar to the 1670s, by when there was a challenge to Aurangzeb. So really the Mughal dominance of Indian subcontinent is really about only 90 years long. And then we have British rule, again, really only for 100 years, when they had pretty much continental control once they had defeated the descendants of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in the late 1840s. And really only the British period before independence enjoyed a monopoly of reach across the entire Indian subcontinent. And the prior examples encompassed much of it, but not in entirety. I hasten to remind viewers that the most important behavioral characteristic of Bharat's pre-modern states, that is before 1000 AD, was constant warfare between the constituent individual states of the landscape of Bharat. This was indeed the critical factor which led to the catastrophic success of the Islamic invasions, because the northern and southern empires were at war. The powerful northern empire of the Rakshutras was weakened, and this was a background to their defeat, and of course the rest is history. Let me summarize the key historical dynamics of Indic knowledge systems and Bharat's international relations very cursorily by highlighting the military and external policies which could be characterized as conforming to the ancient ideas of the epics and Kautilya. And here I'm being very economical in just identifying at random those historical practices which have some degree of echo, or in some cases substantial echo, of the original ideas of India's knowledge system. The first and the most important is the 11th century Suheldev, who defeated the nephew of the Ghaznavids and fought a war of annihilation against an enemy who could not be stopped. And I use the word annihilation deliberately. This was what was required, and that is what was done. And then we have the early 16th century example of Krishnadeva's Vijayanagara Empire, great success. And then the 17th century Marathas of Shivaji and his successors. And finally, before the reprise of the British, Maharaja Ranjit Singh of Punjab. The Marathas were alone in being the true precursors of the unapologetic Bharatiya nationalism that we now are often discussing, and associated cultural awareness. It was Shivaji and his successors who articulated true pan-Indian nationalism. India's external relations after 1947 could be broadly characterized by the term Gandhian capitulationism. Gandhian capitulationism. And secondly, the unwarranted personal control of foreign relations by Jawaharlal Nehru, which is something Kautilya specifically counsels against, that is individual control. In the subsequent era, Gandhian capitulationism continues to remain extremely widespread among an important segment of India's intelligentsia and political elites. Though in fact, actual practice after 1962 departed from this notion of perhaps what I might even call cosmopolitan capitulationism. That pretty much ended in 1962. The near contemporary of Socrates, Kautilya, perceptions and prescriptions are really quite astonishing. If you look in detail at exactly what he recommended, they are quite amazing. there are two issues which have remained unresolved from his time, which is the unrealized aspiration in the defense of Bharat as a whole, which Kautilya thought really truly needed to be pan-Bharat. Now that dream ended in 1947. So we have a more truncated form of pan-Bharat. But Kautilya always believed that local warfare was only justified truly to create this single political unit. The second preference Kautilya had, which is worth mentioning in passing because it's quite controversial in the modern age, that he had a preference for monarchical absolutism, which was to be mirrored later by Socrates' student Plato, who preferred aristocratic rule by a wise and philosopher king. And much later by Thomas Hobbes, who of course was less concerned with the philosopher king, but definitely preferred autocratic rule. Now, Kautilya himself had a preference of monarchical absolutism, but he, of course, says that he prefers a benign and competent autocrat, a benign and competent autocrat, really a rule of wisdom. In some respects, Kautilya can be most appropriately compared to somebody much, much later, Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote a treatise on rulership, The Prince. So here, before I start to talk a little bit about Kautilya, we have the ancient epics, we have Kautilya, and then we have the practice of the pre-modern Indian state, starting with Suheldev, the Vijayanagara Empire, the Marathas, and of course, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. All these three elements are an aspect of India's knowledge systems in theory and practice. I'm not going to give you a systematic account of Kautilya's encyclopedic ideas on politics and interstate policy, which are covered in books 5 to 14 in the main, in the Arthashastra, but only highlight some of them to illustrate the conformity, their conformity with accepted modern notions of realist power. That is, the modern notion of realist power in international relations of Morgenthau, Kenneth Waltz, etc., etc. And by extrapolated methodology, that there is a system of dynamics. One could read this if one so wished in Kautilya too. The ideal state construct that Kautilya constructs is a constructive issue, but it is not constructivist in the contemporary sense, but constructivist purely in the sense that it is based on Kautilya's personal experiences. And in this, he uses the Arthashastra to outline actor-oriented policies. So he has an ideal type state. Now, what is this ideal type state? These are comprised of a ruler, that is the monarch, the government, rural population, capital, the treasury, armed forces, and allies, that is pertaining to other states. This is all very, very contemporary. All of which Kautilya analyzes individually as well as their interdependence. Then he identifies behavioral norms, and I will be very brief with this. He identifies behavioral norms, upaya, valid for both intrastate and interstate relations. And from them, he extrapolates how to conduct foreign policy. I only mention methodology to illustrate the logical and systematic nature of Kautilya's thinking. Most significantly, Kautilya judges state power to be an admixture of material and intellectual resources, a combination of the various dimensions that I earlier mentioned that constitute the state, rather than military power alone. And this makes his conceptualization a very modern one. Kautilya enumerates 6 rules. 6 rules of external policy that are well and truly examples of a realist view on interstate relations. I especially mention the first because it is also the policy apparently of the Modi government, which is, in Kautilya's advice, bide your time through clever diplomacy while you build your nation's strength if your adversary is currently stronger than you. This sounds very much like the Indo-China equation, and that is what Kautilya would have approved. The second injunction of Kautilya is, if you have overwhelming strength, subdue your enemy decisively, but only cripple the ruler of the army. So this is an injunction we are hesitating to follow with our Western neighbor. But then Kautilya also enjoins that once the enemy is defeated, that the population in the territory must be treated generously, and you must desist from plunder and despoliation. There is a third category, and I'm not going to cover all of the third category, is the context of coercive diplomacy, that is, the use of the threat of force and diplomacy when the enemy is stagnating, even if the power ratio between you and the enemy is not quite symmetrical. That is, there's fluidity, the enemy is strong enough, but it's wavering, and then you should employ coercion. How modern all this sounds. Alliances are also considered advisable in Kautilya's framework if it seems impossible to surpass a stronger adversary within a reasonable time frame. So that is what I think definitely has been happening since the beginning of the 21st century in India's political orientation, ally with other countries in order to deal with your much stronger local neighbor. Kautilya, in keeping with the ancient epics, also recommends duplicity with adversary. And he says, you may have an alliance with one country, and then you may embark on an alliance with the second country. But your intention is to find an opportunity to destroy the second partner when the time is appropriate. So that is the kind of duplicity I think India hesitates somewhat to embark on. I do believe this is not quite the case since 2014. And we are now much more willing to behave in ways which Kautilya would have approved of. Kautilya was also, as I have already mentioned earlier, was opposed to the primacy of a sole leader in taking policy decisions, and it is considered inimical to outcomes with one leader. And that includes a case where the leader is capable and has the qualities of wisdom, knowledge, and courage, which are commended by Kautilya. Even so, he feels a single leader should not be taking decisions. Let me conclude this section on Kautilya by quoting the historian Dietemar Rottermann, the German historian, who describes Arthashastra as the grammar of power, accumulation, power distribution, and power preservation. That is, the accumulation of power, power distribution, and power preservation. Now, it seems to me this is very close to the ideas of the likes of Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz and the modern IR. The contention, therefore, I would make is that Kautilya anticipates the core power political underpinning of modern Western international relations theory. So one could argue that modern international relations theory is a rediscovery of the theory of power politics in the 4th century Kautilya's ideas. In fact, modern IR is therefore of Indic origin, if we go by Kautilya. So I'm going to pause for one moment before I go to my next stage, which is to discuss how we have conducted ourselves in the post-1947 period. India has now fought how many wars? 48, 62, 65, 71, 98. But I would in fact argue India has been at permanent war with pauses, which is entirely in keeping with the history of warfare across the world over time. India has faced permanent warfare and with pauses. The first war immediately after independence, 47-48, was the brutal invasion of Jammu and Kashmir. There are very good books on this. The two I would recommend if viewers are interested are by Brigadier L.P. Sen, who was in charge of operations in Jammu and Kashmir in 1947-48. Brigadier L.P. Sen, subsequently, of course, Lieutenant General Lionel Pratap Sen, a very outstanding officer. And then, of course, the book of Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta on Kashmir. That's also a very useful study of the politics of Kashmir. Now, I'm going to have to abbreviate because I think I may run out of time. Now, this is a war in which India suffered the worst setback in its post-independence history. Not only did the Indian armed forces have to confront the killing, pillaging, raping invaders, but there was also very clearly interference in Indian operations on the ground from the two officers, the British officers who were in charge of the Indian Army. And believe you me, this was continuing in the 50s, right till the 60s for the Air Force and Navy. It was led by British officers. These British officers not only were heading the Indian Army, but they were British officers heading the Pakistani Army. Quite clearly, the two chiefs of staff in India, first Sir Robert Lockhart and then Sir Roy Butcher, were in touch with their Pakistani counterparts. And all of them knew of the impending invasion of Kashmir. It is inconceivable that the British officers in touch with London and with each other in Delhi and Rawalpindi were not aware of what was going to happen. So they knew. Lockhart was quickly disposed of because obviously the government of India was not happy, but they put in place Roy Butcher. Two things happened that I mentioned in passing, which shows the deceit, and a third, which preceded the deceit. The first was, L.P. Sen writes in his book at the very end, towards the conclusion, that when the Indian Army was poised for victory beyond Hajipir Pass, Delhi refused reinforcements. It was admittedly a complicated task to reinforce, but it was imperative for India to have been reinforced. And then a second act of betrayal was to replace the hardened Kumanis in key areas with inexperienced soldiers who then were repulsed by the Pakistanis. Hajipir Pass was therefore given back twice, in 48 and 1971, a very crucial strategic location. So India was betrayed by officers appointed by Jawaharlal Nehru. There were repeated requests I had for reinforcements which were not met. The other act of betrayal I'm sure all of you are familiar with is that in 1947, a British soldier, officer Major Brown, invaded Gilgit-Baltistan, forcibly and violently threw out Maharaja Hari Singh's representatives and handed over Gilgit-Baltistan to Jinnah. Now, why did he do that? Gilgit-Baltistan was of enormous strategic importance because it was adjacent to Afghanistan, and the British always thought that these are the areas where we must be present in case the Russians want to come south. Now, without Gilgit-Baltistan, India lost overland access to Afghanistan. This was a catastrophe. And now we have the regular problem of overflight rights too. Even though retaking Gilgit-Baltistan would have been difficult, if any other leader had been in power, whether it was Churchill, Stalin, or Mao, you would have devoted national resources to fight to return it to India because it was of huge strategic importance. So our genius Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who insisted that he was a master of diplomacy and international relations, understood nothing. Loss of Gilgit-Baltistan was the single biggest setback for the Indian Union. And of course, the Western forces in Afghanistan have regretted that because they had to beg Pakistan for access through Karachi harbor to resupply their troops in Afghanistan, which they could have achieved if India controlled Gilgit-Pakistan by road. The long historical British campaign to secure Jammu and Kashmir with Pakistan for geopolitical reasons should have ended in 1956 after Britain was expelled from the Suez Canal. But no, even today, scores of British MPs are fighting the battle for Pakistan. They are demanding a plebiscite. British MPs, 30, 40, and I would say if they came to a vote, over 100 MPs would at the very least vote in favor of a plebiscite. Now, let me just say something quickly, which is in the article, which I'm not going to discuss any further. In 1954, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru offered a plebiscite to Liaquat Ali Khan. But Liaquat Ali Khan and the Pakistanis knew they were going to lose because of the fresh memories of the pillage, murder, and rape in 1947-48. So they didn't want a plebiscite. So they used an excuse that they would choose the plebiscite administrator. And they were insisting it has to be Admiral Nimitz of the US Navy, because Pakistan was by then very close to the Anglo-Americans, and they thought Nimitz would be sympathetic. And they rejected Nehru's insistence that it should be a neutral Scandinavian administrator for the plebiscite. So Pakistan actually repudiated the plebiscite. And then the plebiscite has become a non-starter because, first of all, ceding territory has changed the entire story on the ground. Ceding territory to China has meant it is no longer the Jammu and Kashmir area on which the UNSC passed a resolution recommending a plebiscite. So it's not the same territory. And secondly, they have made a tremendous effort to alter the demography. So the idea of a plebiscite sanctioned in 47, 48 is no longer legally valid. I should also add the plebiscite first required the Pakistani forces to withdraw from Jammu and Kashmir completely and hand it over to the Indian forces before a plebiscite could take place, which they refused to do. There was some also conspiracy in the UN. There was also some conspiracy in the UN where the Indian diplomats failed to make the appeal on the appropriate grounds. But I'll let that pass. Let me now move on to the period after that. That is 1962, the other. India actually really failed to learn from the abysmal errors of 1947 and 48 in Jammu and Kashmir. Jawaharlal Nehru continued to blunder, ideologically fixated, overconfident, and unwilling to take counsel from his own prudent colleagues. And other advisors. He allowed himself to be persuaded by his unschooled sister, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and K.M. Panikkar, whom Sardar Patel virtually accused of treason. These were the two people he listened to. let me just summarize some of the issues that I wanted to speak about. Throughout the 1950s, a very capable diplomat who was actually the junior to K.M. Panikkar, his name is Sumal Sinha, who retired as ambassador to Lebanon. He was India's foremost expert on China, spoke fluent Mandarin, had been in China during the revolution, and he had warned Nehru first of the impending Chinese invasion of Tibet, to which Nehru acceded without reaching any kind of deal on Tibetan autonomy. Basically, he did not. And he ratified that in the Panchsheel Agreement. Sumal Sinha then warned him of clashes which did occur in the late 50s between India and China, was warning him. And then Sumal Sinha warned him again that China would invade India. At this point, Nehru told him, "You don't understand diplomacy," and banished him to Harvard to do a course. And of course, China attacked in 62. An attack on an unprepared army. It is said the Indian army was defeated. This is another falsity which our left-wing historians and British accounts have perpetuated. The Indian army was only 4 brigades, which confronted a whole corps of the Chinese armed forces, which is 4 divisions and more. So 4 ill-equipped brigades had to confront. And in this, I have a colleague who's still alive and I work with, who actually fought in 62 in an area just adjacent to Rezangla. The Kumanis fought to the last man, inflicting huge casualty. So this canard that the Indian army was defeated is incorrect, factually. 4 brigades were devastated, ill-equipped, and ill-prepared. And this again is the blame of Jawaharlal Nehru and his then Finance Minister Morarji Desai, who declined an increase in defense spending in the late 50s. And in fact, Nehru told Krishna Menon, "I'm sorry, I have to agree with Morarji Bhai at this moment." So India went in unequipped. So basically, India was under-equipped. And then Nehru did 2 things. One was to engage in a forward policy without the preparation which was required in case the Chinese attacked. Forward policy was provocative at the time. And this was due to incorrect advice given by Sarvapalli Gopal, who had been sent to London to look at documents and came back and told Nehru, "Our claims are absolutely solid." There were unresolved issues which made the claims more controversial. India's claims were legitimate indeed, but they were not solid in the way Sarvapalli Gopal told Nehru. In fact, he had basically given a spin to what he had seen and exaggerated. So the forward policy in combination, the wrong advice had already placed it in jeopardy. There was another issue which was of vital importance. The state of Sino-Soviet relations, which after Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech was very clear to observers, had broken down. And Nehru did not pay enough attention to the fact that the Soviet Union would not intervene to stop Chinese aggression. In fact, the Soviet Union in 62 was very ambiguous, which it was not, say, in 1971. So India was led into a veritable trap by Nehru's foolishness dating back to the 50s and his unwillingness to listen even to Giriya Shankar Vajpayee, his own then what is now called Foreign Secretary, refused to listen to him, who had told him the loss of Tibet is of enormous geopolitical significance. And of course, we now know that John F. Kennedy had offered India nuclear weapons to India to make India into a nuclear power to balance China, which was dismissed personally by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who had no education, no training. But she thought Mao was a Gandhi. That's what she wrote, that Mao was like Gandhi. This mass murderer was deemed to be a saint. Now then, come to the 65 war before I move on very quickly. Between 63 and 64, there was before Nehru died, General J.N. Chaudhary was given the task of reforming the Indian Army. Now, the gentleman whom I refer to as a colleague of mine who fought in 62, also fought in 65, and he said, without the reforms of General Chaudhary, we would have lost Delhi. That bad. He's a retired Major General in Chandigarh with whom I work. Now, Pakistan has actually made very important gains, we forget. Pakistan was on the verge of taking Kashmir. And this basically failed because the general who was very successful was Ahmadiyya, and he was withdrawn by Ayub Khan because they didn't want Pakistan's greatest hero to be a Ahmadiyya. Because what he had done was to virtually cut off Jammu, which would have meant loss of Kashmir. And they sent somebody whose name we became familiar with later on, Yahya Khan, to take over. And that pause and error allowed the Indian forces to repel Pakistan. Pakistan also was threatening Amritsar. And the Indian armies were instructed to retreat beyond the rivers, Satluj. But a great Indian general, Harbaksh Singh, refused the order, fought back brilliantly, and again repelled the forces. The one thing I will say about the 65 war, and we were very fortunate to have a diminutive, modest, reserved man with an iron will, Lal Bahadur Shastri. And his leadership was absolutely paramount because he was a Kautilyan. He was willing to concede nothing. And it is to our great, great disadvantage that he died in a very unexplained way abroad. And that's a story which has not been fully explained, because not only was a great foreign policy strategist, but he had begun reform of Indian farming, the foreign exchange, which is haunting us today, this very week. He had begun the reform of Indian agriculture and with greater marketization. So that was a great loss. Now let me move on very quickly to the 1971 war. That war, as Chandrasekhar Gupta in his recent book has affirmed, something I have always known because the architect of our victory was General Jacob, a very good friend of mine, whose 2 volumes of biography I've reviewed, and whom I used to meet often, and to whose funeral I went in Delhi and, in fact, slept on the floor of his bedroom in Som Bihar. He did 2 things. People say, oh, no, he has claimed too much. He did only 2 things. One, he insisted, as Chandrasekhar Gupta has now reaffirmed, that let's not fight a conventional war and try and take every town. Let's go straight for Dhaka. Now, that plan was rejected. But then the Director General of Military Operations, Director of DGMO, who replaced the previous person, agreed with him. And at the very end, Jacob got his way. So that was Jacob. And Jacob told me all the way he was fighting with his Indian army, get off the Pakka road and stay on the Kacha road to hide yourself. So he got to Dhaka. And then he realized something which I'm afraid Chandrasekhar Gupta perhaps is not explained adequately. And he understood the importance of getting Lieutenant General Niazi, the dictator in East Pakistan, to sign a surrender document before the Polish resolution on the United Nations Security Council calling for a ceasefire. Now, the Russians had guaranteed and vetoed the previous resolution, but they had said they would not necessarily veto the Polish resolution demanding a ceasefire, which would have frozen the status quo in favor of Pakistan. So Pakistan could have fought on and prolonged the war for much longer because India only had about 12,000 soldiers in Dhaka and they had tens of thousands. But with a mixture of chicanery and threats, which Jacob does deny that I did not threaten him, he says, he got Niazi to sign the surrender. Now, this was the masterstroke, a diplomatic masterstroke. Before the Polish resolution, India had won a total victory. So these are the two things Jacob has claimed. In the books he has written about himself and his experience, he pays ample tribute to officers and others who fought with him. He does not say, I won the war anywhere. And you know what he talks about as his greatest success in his entire life is not the Bangladesh war, not his extraordinarily successful governorship of the Punjab. He says on the last day of President's rule in Goa, he managed to go down to the archives to look for documents which had been hidden from him, find them, and sign them to protect the Western Ghats. That is what he said was my greatest lifetime's achievement, protecting the Western Ghats, basically from mining. That is a truly dharmic individual. I'm afraid we lost a lot in the 71 negotiations because in Shimla, our diplomats, Haksar, Kaul, Dhar, were all very mindful of the favor the Soviets did by mobilizing 300,000 troops on the Sino-Soviet border to warn China not to intervene, veto on the UN on the first occasion. So we felt very grateful. And the Russians were telling us, please do not impose a harsh peace. And the reason for that, Russia was due to sign the SALT talks with the United States strategic arms limitation, which happened in 72. They did not want to jeopardize that. And they were pressing India to be less than harsh. Had I been the diplomat, I wouldn't have cared. I would have done what Kautilya would have approved of. You do what is important for your country. And there were 2 or 3 things which are very important. The Chinese didn't give, the Pakistanis didn't care one bit about the 90,000 being held in India, soldiers and officers. They were very happy for them to be fed. What they cared for was the return of the Hajipir Pass, which we had taken. And I'm afraid we gave it back again. And the other thing which we should have done was to hand over the entire officer corps to the new government of Bangladesh for war crimes trials. And this would have poisoned Bangladesh-Pakistan relations for countless generations. And I'm afraid now Pakistan is making a great play to revive its ties to Bangladesh. This could have prevented if Bangladesh had been allowed as they wished for war trials. But this is where we made a grievous mistake, as we did with Gilgit-Baltistan, as we did in 71, not pressing your advantage when it was imperative and worrying too much about what the Russians would have thought. The Russians wouldn't have done that for anybody else. They would have done what was important for them. Now, I won't say much about the 98 war in Kargil, all of which you're familiar with. It was our determination as Indians to fight a war, to retake. We took a huge number of casualties, over 550 soldiers died, but Pakistan was again defeated because we gave no quarter. And then basically, we have had one very big betrayal with which I will stop. This was the betrayal of 2611. I've recently done a program on Manushi with RVS Mani, the former Home Minister official, where the complicity of the Indian authorities seems to have been very clear. What RSN Singh, the former raw officer, calls it a fixed match. There is now huge evidence that something was grievously amiss in 2611, that we had been warned by the Americans of a pending attack on the Mumbai coastline. They didn't share more because David Headley, who had informed them, was their double agent, and they didn't want to jeopardize and compromise him by telling us the whole story. But we had been warned, and that is in the book written by Adrian Levy and a fellow journalist. It's in the book. And there were all sorts of bizarre things which happened. The delay for the commandos leaving Delhi, the delay in their transportation to the hotels which were being attacked. Many, many strange things happened. In fact, let me conclude with one extraordinary comment which is published in the newspapers, that a senior Mumbai civil servant who left the Taj Hotel just before the attack. She writes, "I left unscathed." And in the Home Ministry war room occupied by RVS Mani, another colleague, says to Mani, it seems she inaugurated the assault before leaving. This is something I'm simply reporting. So this is our story. We were a soft state thanks to Nehru's misguided cosmopolitan self-regard. We became a harder state in 65, but we continued to make mistakes in 71, far less in 98. And I would say after 2014, people may criticize lack of action. Our system is much more calculating, much more willing to take action. But let me stress, calculation is the essence, and only the insiders will know the whole story. And in general, my view is diplomacy must remain absolutely critical, very much in the tradition of Kautilya for the next 10, 15 years. India needs 10, 15 years of peace in order to consolidate its economy. Even if it means some temporary setback, preserving India's peace and its economic prospects is the most important long-term interest. And everything I'm seeing in the behavior of our incumbent government, our excellent External Affairs Minister and the team, the NSA and the Prime Minister himself, is very mindful of the rationale for maneuvering, for diplomacy, in order that I hope in 10 years, we become a serious and important player, and then we will not be vulnerable as we have been over 1,000 years. Namaskar, dhanyavad.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was an extremely insightful session. I think we've really gained a lot from your experience, and also how beautifully you blended it with Kautilya's Arthashastra. If it's okay, can we take some questions from participants?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, just requesting participants can. Yes, Rajiv ji, would you like to go first? Just unmute you.
Yeah, thank you. Namaskar, Professor Sen. So I will ask quickly 3 questions, but very quickly. So first one, given our knowledge base right from Kautilya about international relations, were we ever colonized in the sense that our masses, we were colonized in the harder sense, but in the softer sense? So that is the first question. Second, with relation to the UN Security Council, the permanent membership is with the people or with countries who are actually not contributing to peacemaking. Okay, they are not contributing. India is among one of the highest contributors, who is also economically well-to-do, but there are other countries who are there at the top, in which India also figures. And the third one, do you think soft is the real hard in terms of international relations? So these are the 3 questions.
Well, India was defeated at war by superior forces, and the key reason was internal division. That was the key reason, and the wars between the northern, southern, and eastern states grievously weakened because India had resisted for a long time. And even after that, Suhail Dev victories repulsed invaders for 170 years. They didn't come back for 170 years. So internal weakness, because the population is there. I recognize the invaders who came, the Turkic Central Asians, were extremely proficient in warfare because of their long experience of extraordinary warfare. And they defeated the Europeans. They almost took Vienna. They took the heart of Christianity, Constantinople. So they were very proficient warriors. But India, by sheer virtue of population size and ability, could have resisted. But bear in mind, they never enjoyed total primacy. This is a myth perpetuated by leftist Islamist historians. They never enjoyed a monopoly. What began with the Sultanate and the Mughals was a continuing state of warfare in India. There was a brief pause when they had all of India from the height of Akbar's reign to the middle of Aurangzeb, from 1560 to about 1650, they had reach across that point, but there was battles all the time. So in a way, the war which began 1,000 years before is carrying on to this day. We have had long pauses, retreats, but we have always fought. So that is not over. For the UN Security Council, this is a complicated calculation. India, as you know, of course, refused a seat in favor of China. It was offered to India. India refused. Let's forget about that. This was a mistake, we know, which was made, a big mistake. Should India have a seat? I have mixed feelings about that. Because India remains a weak power compared to the other players, the big players. India remains a weak power. And we will be placed in a very difficult situation of having to cast the veto when we should actually say nothing and do nothing. That we should not get involved in these big disputes where we'll be obliged to cast the veto or abstain. We will be faced with difficult choices as a member of the veto powers. Now, this is not a clear-cut advantage as far as I can see. It may put us in difficulties. Of course, most Indians will not agree with me. They are very desperate. India has the prestige. But I'm not so concerned about prestige. I'm concerned about power politics. As for India's colonization, what we call nowadays, we've had a boil wash in the washing machine. Our civilization has had a boil wash at 90 degrees in the washing machine of foreign colonial. And I would only advise you to read the best book, which is #1 Amazon non-fiction list by my friend for whom I've written the foreword, J. Sai Deepak, on Bharat. And that book actually captures the whole story of our colonial experience and its continuing relevance. So our main battle remains the intellectual one, which Rishud and Rashtram is fighting, much to my delight. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there are any more questions, we would just request if participants could raise their hands or type it into the chat box. Yes, go ahead, Sanjeevji, please go ahead.
Sir, one small, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Am I audible?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes,
a small question from the margins. Thank you. A small question from the margins. You made some references to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. Did she really have some kind of major role to play in India's foreign policy? And you also, once or twice referred to her as unlettered. And, I'm just wondering, are we looking at these figures rather too much in binaries? Because, the few times that I met her as a child, I did meet her a few times, she also came across very much as a sort of patriot. So is there some complexity to her, or was she just a colonized mind?
I have met her too, because her granddaughter in London was a near contemporary and friend of mine. She had come to London. Perfectly civil, pleasant person. I am not making any adverse personal remark. But I'll tell you a story about her rather than argue. When she was sent to Russia as India's first ambassador, she was the first ambassador, Stalin refused to accept her credentials personally. She had to go to Molotov. And the reason why, Russia in 47 was a devastated country. It had lost 40 million people. All the cities were in ruins. People were starving. Stalin was informed, as was Nehru, that one of the first things she did was to import expensive furniture from Scandinavia. And this irked Stalin. Now, this bespeaks of basic poor judgment. Stalin absolutely refused to see her. Though when Radhakrishnan was there, they got on famously. He used to call Radhakrishnan Professor. And there was one episode, look at the closeness of Radhakrishnan, the other ambassador. The interpreter was in the room, and Stalin asked Radhakrishnan, do you think I'll be punished and sent to hell for all my crimes? He actually said that. Apparently, Radhakrishnan put his arm over his shoulder to the horror of the interpreter and said, comrade, We don't even know if there is a God, so don't worry about it. So that's Radhakrishnan. Look at the contrast. Now, I know that Vijayalakshmi Pandit was the one who personally repudiated the offer of nuclear weapons directly to the US administration. She personally, without reference to Nehru, she already told, she had the authority, she already said, we don't want your nuclear weapons. Now, all these are poor judgments. And K.M. Panikkar too. I mean, Sardar said Patel said he was a traitor, he was advocating China's cause. And Sumo Sinha, who got everything right, said, I have offended the old man, and the old man, as I said, sent him off to Harvard to do a course. And K.M. Panikkar constantly advocated China's position. And Nehru was very flattered because the Chinese had asked him to convey this message to the Americans that if MacArthur crossed the Yalu River, the Chinese would intervene. So the moment MacArthur crossed the Yalu River, so Nehru was very flattered to be an international statesman. And with the system, I'm sorry, unschooled, unlettered does count. I'm afraid book knowledge and learning do count. Not that everybody's book learning leads to good outcomes. I would be the last to say that. And nor that people with book learning have nothing more to learn. But training and book learning are very important. They are a first step. They are not everything. And I know there are people with native intelligence. I don't exclude the fact. I would be deeply wrong to say people without education cannot. Our Prime Minister has had relatively little formal education. But I don't think there are many diplomats with a finer mind than his. So I don't want to overplay this. And if I have conveyed that impression, I apologize. But I do feel the mistakes which are evident in Vijayalakshmi Pandit, courteous and pleasant person that I also recall she was, still do matter. Okay.
We also have one question from Dr. Kayal Virji. If you could just unmute yourself.
So it was a very wonderful session, knowing about the background of the war which took place in India. And one thing, what would we take to our students, the positivity and the negativity of the leadership in the war, 1962 war or 1971 war? So how do we educate our students? What is the positivity we get from the leadership and the negativity so that our students become good leaders of future?
Well, you know, first of all, they need to know the facts. They need to understand what mistakes were made in order that they're not repeated. That's the first thing. Secondly, you know, we are a very meek and forgiving people.
Yes.
I see that all the time. And I'm not happy with that.
Yes.
I'm not happy with that.
Yes.
It is a strength, but it's also a weakness.
Weakness.
In a civilizational sense, being forgiving is a very important part of our dharma.
Yes.
But it is not good in a Kautilyan sense of state policy.
Yes.
And that's Suheldev and the Marathas showed. They showed no mercy to their adversaries. So we have to mix this very difficult balance of being on a private level forgiving, in a historic level, civilization forgiving, but also to be hard. So we must have, I'm afraid, what I would call blind love for our country. At this moment, I do not love my country blindly. I am its biggest critic. But if I meet an adversary, then I love my country blindly. And if I have to criticize my country, I will do it only with my fellow Indians who are not doing it in bad faith. So we must have blind love for our country. Otherwise, we will not survive. So we need to understand our errors. We also have our heroes.
Yes.
There's a wonderful YouTube video by somebody whom I've never met called Smita Mukherjee on the origins of Indian nationalism.
Okay.
I would say watch it. The origins of Indian nationalism. She is not, by the way, she is not an expert either. She is an autodidact, but she is as good as any expert. That is one worth reading. And then I say to people, please read Sai Deepak's book on Bharat, the great book that he has recently written. Read that book to understand where our many weaknesses came from.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for the true facts which you have shared with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a real honor to have you with us. And we are extremely privileged and very grateful for you to be here. And thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you.
Namaste.
I can disconnect.
Yes, sure, sir. Thank you.